Today we're going to discuss how to bin or binning, and that is another way to say categorizing qualitative data. And this is done when you have open-ended questions in your survey that can't be organized automatically. They have to be sorted manually. And so what we're looking at right now on the screen is what I downloaded from Qualtrics. So I had a survey that had actually all open-ended questions because it was a survey that we administrated over the phone, but we cataloged the answers inside of a Qualtrics survey. So this is what that data looks like downloaded. It's not cleaned up at all. This is just what Qualtrics automatically generates. So in order to bin my open-ended questions, what I did with this data set was I went through and for each open-ended question, I copied it and then I moved it onto its own sheet with some other information. So if we go over here to this one, this sheet, question 1, familiar with stars is the name of it. You can see I copied over the question and all the responses to this question. And then I also copied over the name of the county, the city, the person, and then that person's position. So this is just giving me some information for which response belongs to which person. Now, a lot of times in a survey, you won't have names to attach a response to. A lot of surveys are anonymous. However, if you're administering over the phone, then you obviously would know who you're talking to. So with that said, there's a few ways, or at least a couple of ways that you can bin the data. And the first step is to create the bins or the categories. So for this question, it's fairly easy to create the categories. The question is, are you familiar with the Transparency Stars program? If yes, is it important to you to be compliant with the program? So the bins that I created were, number 1, they're familiar with the program. Number 2, they're not familiar with the program. And number 3, it's important to them to be compliant with the program. So the way that I would bin this is I would go through and I would read the response. Not particularly, I have heard of some of the requirements, but have not researched it. Particularly, yes, it is important to be compliant. So then I would assign this response into bins. So they fit into bin number 1, they are familiar. And then they also fit into bin number 3, it's important to be compliant. So now I'll move to the next one. Not sure what the program is. We have law and guidelines of how transparent we should be. We have to do various newspaper publications. So they are not familiar with the program, so they fall into that bin. And they also don't indicate that it's important to them to be compliant with the program. So I would leave bin number 3 empty on that response. And then I would just go through all of my responses and do the same thing. I would put them into bins. And then when I'm done, I would be able to analyze these categories numerically, just like I would with a question from a survey that was multiple choice, for example. So I could run some statistical analysis. I don't know what the answers are. So it would be maybe 50% are familiar with the program, but only 20% indicated that it was important to them to be compliant. So only after going through this process can you do numerical analysis, because you can't do numerical analysis on words. So that is the purpose of binning. And some other advice that I would give you is that when you find a response that is a great example of one of your bins, I would highlight it. Or maybe I would highlight it over here and I would say, okay, when I am writing up my paper or putting together my presentation and I want to use a quote from my responses that is a perfect example of that category, then I would come through here and see where I highlighted for the different categories. Then I would go over and pull that response into my paper or my presentation. This way, I don't have to dig back through and reread all of the responses in order to find a good example. Now, creating the categories is not always as simple as you saw on that question. So moving to my next sheet, this one, the question was, what do you feel are the biggest obstacles to being open and transparent with constituents? And as you see, I have a lot of bins on this question. And I also followed a different binning technique where I wrote the names But I don't recommend this. I would recommend doing the numbers like I showed you on the previous one because it will make the analysis easier. Anyway, the point of this, showing this sheet to you, is to talk about what to do when you have a lot of bins. So I had approximately 68 responses to this question, so it makes sense that I have a large number of bins. And because creating bins is subjective, it's important that you are the expert on the bins that you create. So what I mean by that is if you need to defend the bins that you created, you are ready and able to do that. And that is done by simply explaining your reasoning for creating the bins that you did. So for example, if I'm giving my presentation and my client asks me, well, what does that infrastructure bin mean? And I would need to be able to respond to that. And so what I would say, oh, so we interviewed Grimes, and they mentioned that infrastructure was their biggest obstacle. And what they meant by that is they live in a rural area and they often have issues with their internet provider. That's what they meant by infrastructure issues. And I would need to be able to do the same thing for every single category that I created. That way, there's no question about the quality or the reliability of the bins that you have created. So that is the basics of binning, and I hope that it helps you as you strive to do the binning for your own project.